This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today, I'm speaking with Diane Boyd, a world-renowned wildlife biologist and active participant in wolf recovery in the Northern Rockies over the last 40 years.
We humans have a society that's more much like wolves. I think we have so many parallels because we're both social species that live in packs, human packs, wolf packs, and have very many similar behaviors.
Diane's memoir, A Woman Among Wolves, is an engaging and illuminating account of her years of experience with wolves and people. Diane, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Justin. I'm excited to join you here.
So tell us, where did you grow up and what did your parents do?
I grew up in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, a suburban child, and my dad was a chemist and eventually the plant engineer at General Mills, and my mother, as was typical that time, was a housewife and child raiser.
And what was your first experience with a wolf?
I really wanted to see them up in the Boundary Waters canoe area when I was in high school, and I would drive up there to camp, but I never did see them there. So my first experience other than a zoo would have been when I volunteered on the captive wolf project that Dave Meach was running just outside of the Twin Cities.
Can you remember the first time you saw one?
In the wild?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, yes. I was after I did this, volunteered at this captive research facility, I was offered the opportunity to volunteer on Dave Meach's wild wolf research program up in northern Minnesota. And I was on my way driving up to the job site. It's an old rustic field station. And I was driving the highway, winding. I was getting really sleepy. It was dark. And then all of a sudden, in my headlights, just right out of the woods, this wolf shot across in front of my headlights, and I jammed on the brakes because I almost hit it. And then I had to pull over to the side of the road for a couple of minutes and let the adrenaline settle. But so the very first wild wolf I saw, I almost killed.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah.
And at
But
what point?
I didn't hit it.
Right. That's important. A footnote. Exactly.
Yeah.
I feel compelled to sort of share my first experience, and maybe you can riff off of that a little
Sure.
bit. Like there was a time in my life where I thought I had seen a wolf, and it was some other sort of dog, or most likely a set of coyotes or something. And then the first time I saw one, I was like, oh yeah, that's what a wolf is like. That is decidedly not a coyote. It is
Yes.
much bigger and moves entirely differently and just emanates a different energy in a way. And I don't know if that impression was drawn from my sense of the lore around wolves, but it just felt like a different experience.
Yes. When people tell me, I think I saw a wolf, when I hear them say, I think I saw, generally it's probably not. Because when
Right.
you see a wolf, you just know. They're
Yeah.
very big. They like you say, they carry themselves different. And it's sort of like if you see a bear dash across the road, if it's a grizzly bear, you know it's a grizzly bear, not a black bear. Same deal.
And so you have this series of experiences, you develop an interest in wolves, you have your undergraduate studies, and then you end up in Moose City, Montana. It might be a place that not many people listening have heard of. Talk about Moose City. What is it like to live there?
So Moose City is a quaintly named spot. It's not a city at all. It's an old abandoned homestead that was started in 1910 with the first homestead cabin, and then over the next few decades, subsequent owners built on little rustic cabins with the ideas of maybe renting these cabins out to loggers or miners or vacationers. And it was really just a very eclectic collection of old log buildings that were in need of some TLC. And then it was bought by a private entity and became the Moose City Corporation. And it was updated and upgraded by private landowners here in the Flathead Valley. They run it as a co-op deal and they timeshare it out. It's an incredibly special place, and it's literally at the end of the road as far as you get away from probably civilization in Montana, at least far away from the Flathead.
Yeah, I mean, how far from the Canadian border is it?
from the Canadian border, maybe 400 yards.
Okay. And describe the place where you landed up there.
When I first arrived at the border area to study wolves, I shared an old log cabin across from the customs station that was shared by the Border Grizzly Project, run by Chuck Jonkel and his students and technicians, and the Wolf Project. And then after a year or so of that, then I moved into Moose City and I became the caretaker of the cabins in Moose City. And so my old cabin was actually built in 1909. So it
Wow.
was homesteaded a year before Glacier Park became a park. And it was right on the river. I wasn't 25 feet from the North Fork of the Flathead River. And it had majestic views into the park. There's a huge meadow behind all the cabins. It's close to a mile long. It's just a grass hay meadow. And we landed our airplane on that, just a little tiny Cessna. And it's full of elk and bears and moose and occasionally a wolf.
Yeah. So let's talk about that occasionally a wolf phrase. You tell the story in your book, but it's a piece of the history of wolves that not all listeners might be familiar with. Reintroduction in Yellowstone gets a lot of the attention, but wolves were coming back into Montana and other areas before that. Talk about that history and the moment you found yourself up in the Flathead.
I was very lucky to arrive in Montana when the very first wolf successfully walked down from Canada and stayed and reproduced. And a few wolves meander down from Canada where they'd be shot or hang out as loners, but there wasn't really a viable population until this first wolf, Kishnina, came along and we got a radio collar on her in 79. The important point of why I wrote the book, in a lot of talks, I always stress that these wolves in northwestern Montana walked down on their own from Canada. Nobody carried them through arched gates and huge steel crates supported by the government. These wolves just ran the gauntlet through southeastern British Columbia and southwestern Alberta and avoided humans long enough to make it to the sanctuary of Glacier National Park. So
Mm-hmm.
nobody put them there. And these, to this day, those wolves up there, they're native wolves, and there's no way of arguing against that.
And why is that important?
Well, I've been doing wolves in Montana since 79, and I've heard many times people say, oh, these wolves were put here.
Right.
They don't belong here. They're foreign Canadian wolves and they weigh 175 pounds, and it goes on and on. Like, no, these wolves arrived through a walkabout by some other ancestors and they belong here.
As you're witnessing this population of wolves gain a foothold in northwest Montana, you're focused on the science, but you're also living amongst a population of people that are starting to adapt to these wolves being around. You tell a lot of those stories in the book, but yeah, just talk about that moment of, there's probably an excitement and an interest from the scientific perspective, but there's also this interface with the community to the extent there is one that you're also living with as well.
The wolves that came to the North Fork were lucky in that at that time it was a very low density human population, and there was only, I'd say, one and a half livestock producers. Rachel Sweet didn't stay very long, and then there was the Ladenburgs who had cattle. But that was it. There wasn't much opportunity for conflicts like there is now. And the local people in the North Fork, I think most of them thought it was pretty cool to have a wolf or two around.
Sure.
It was novel, and they didn't go out of their way to bother the wolves, and they were interested in learning more about them. I depended on the local community for information when they would see and hear wolves and see tracks, and it was a very lucky time for those wolves to arrive there at that time.
And what was the first sort of point of conflict with a wolf and a landowner or an ag producer, somebody who experienced the wolf in a negative way?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think the wolves in the North Fork ever killed a dog, which is pretty common now. I don't think it was ever documented that they killed any cattle. There were no sheep. So the conflict really wasn't with the one livestock grower. It was potentially more with, I don't think bothered any livestock. People had chickens and a few goats. To the best of my knowledge, they never killed any of them.
Yeah.
There may have been more of a perceived conflict between hunters who may have felt the wolves were competing with them.
Yeah, the theories about elk herds changing in response to the presence of wolves. We'll get to those. Before we do, I'd like to stay in Moose City for a little bit longer.
Sure.
Talk about, to the extent there's a such thing as a typical day as a field wildlife biologist. Talk us through a day in the life of Diane Boyd at that time of your life.
Summer times were spent trying to capture and radio collar wolves, and that involved using a modified foothold trap, the same ugly tool that was used, ironically, to get rid of them, except that
Yeah.
we modified the traps, replaced triggers, replaced jaws, and so forth, and we checked them often. So that was the daily routine in the summer, was to put out traps, try and catch a wolf, get him collared. When you got one collared, you'd move the trap line, you'd pull up stakes, and you'd go somewhere else. Might be Alberta, might be British Columbia, might be Montana, might be Glacier Park, but always basing around Glacier Park. In the wintertime, the normal was that we had a crew of volunteers, anywhere from 2 to 4, usually, sometimes maybe another person. And our job basically was to locate where the wolves are, and then every day go back to where they were the day before or the day before that, and backtrack them so as not to disturb their movements. We tried to never stay on their tails. We did not want to alter their behavior or force them to move in any direction because we were tracking them. So we were really careful to just go backwards. The data collected in the winter, we mapped all this trails on maps and acetate overlays. This was before the days of GPSs, but then we eventually got that transferred into a GIS data system. But the trails the wolves would travel became great information for me in the summer for trying to catch them.
And so you lay that out as sort of a matter of fact set of work responsibilities, but the environment you're living in, I mean, you're in a remote cabin, probably without running water, electricity. You can't just drive up and set your trap. Like, you got to put the traps where the wolves are likely to be. That probably doesn't correspond with roads and trails and whatnot. You're living among them in a way. Is that accurate to say?
The day to day was, yeah, we were living very remotely. No electricity, no running water, no power, no plumbing, no pavement, no phones. We eventually got a mobile phone. When it worked, it was great, but that wasn't very often. It was before the days of computer and internet. It's hard to imagine that now for most people because most people are younger. But the wolves actually did travel roads and trails a lot because, just like us, they try to get from A to B quickly, and they
Sure.
travel roads and trails, and then when they catch a scent of game, they're off in pursuit. Or, of course, I can't randomly go out and put a trap in the forest. I mean, you're likely to pick up anything, if anything at all. So you have to go where they travel frequently, and you look for scats, scent posts, scratch marks, and then, of course, using the winter data helped a lot.
We'll be back to my conversation with Diane Boyd after this short break. A New Angle is proudly presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. This show does not happen without these pillars of our community, and I'm so grateful for their support and encouragement. And speaking of support, have you checked out our new website yet? anewanglepodcast.com. There you can support our show directly with a variety of subscription options. Subscribers get access to bonus episodes, additional segments, writings, and other benefits. So check it out at anewanglepodcast.com.
This is John Twiggs with Montana PBS, and you're listening to A New Angle.
Welcome back to A New Angle. I'm speaking with renowned biologist Diane Boyd about her 40 years of experience with wolves. You mentioned traps a moment ago. They were a necessary part of your work, but they're also a form of capturing wolves that you seem to have some judgment around in the book. Talk about trapping and trappers and so forth.
My years of trapping, it started in Minnesota in the late 70s. I never was a fur trapper. I mean, I was born and raised in the city, so the first things that I was trying to catch was wolves, and that's how I learned. And wolves are the most cunning, challenging animal out there to catch. So I started right at the top, and I brought those skills out here. And I learned over the years how to be more species specific and have less non-target species, or bycatch is another phrase for that, to only mostly try to just catch wolves. But in the process, I ended up catching coyotes and bears and deer, and I always felt terrible about it. And I think that traps are a really good tool to catch wildlife, but I also think they're a really bad tool for damaging wildlife. I've come a long ways on that. And I got to the end of my career where every time I'd catch a wolf, I would feel some satisfaction knowing I got the job done, but I'd walk up and apologize internally before I went up to sedate it and put the radio collar on. So I kind of come full circle on that.
So I will disclose, I am not a hunter, although I have plenty of friends that hunt and I help them pack out meat. I just don't have the skills. But I'd love to talk about hunting ethics, because that's a thread that kind of comes through your book in many ways. You have deep experience in hunting. You spend a lot of time around hunters. People want to hunt wolves. Wolves are predators. How do you get your head around hunting and the ethics of hunting? To the extent you have a personal hunting ethic, what is it and how did you arrive at it?
That's a very interesting question. I haven't been asked that in an interview. So I'll start by saying that I am a hunter. Those years I lived at Moose City, I hunted deer and elk, and I'd go over to east and hunt antelope, and I ate everything that I harvested, didn't waste anything, and I counted on it. I counted on it for my existence. And now I don't do that anymore, except that I'm a passionate bird hunter and I train bird dogs. One is laying on my feet right now, and I get the same thrill of the hunt, and I get to use canines in the process. It's all good, right? But I find it interesting that hunters really, some of them really like to hunt predators, be it coyotes or wolves or mountain lions or whatever. They like to feel like a predator themselves, but oftentimes I think they don't understand the value of a predator to the ecosystem. It's kind of an interesting twist.
Yeah. And how do you make your choices in that space?
As a hunter, I feel strongly that a hunter needs to use fair chase ethics. And most people that I hang around with and hunt with, we all agree with that. And that's part of the reason having a bird dog is with a bird dog, your birds don't get away wounded. You don't lose anything unless you barely touch the bird with your shot. But in terms of big game, I would say that I experienced the same thrill of the hunt, if I can call it that without offending some of your listeners.
Yeah.
I had the same thrill of the hunt when I was trapping wolves, because you're out there in the wild in their element and you're trying to be as cautious and sneaky and methodical and intellectual as you can be about matching wits with something that's incredibly smart, be it an elk or a wolf or whatever. And to catch an animal in a trap when I was younger, that was my reward, was knowing that I had succeeded in catching the wildest animal out there, the smartest.
Sure.
And as a hunter, you do it ethically and you're working really hard, and maybe you hunted several days to just get the perfect lineup to shoot an elk or an antelope or a deer. And then you have that moment where the gift is delivered to you and a deer steps out into a clearing. I never take a long shot. And there it is, and it stops.
Yeah.
Though that's how I line things up. I've never taken a running shot. I don't take long shots. And so I see that's the same thing. The only difference for me is that when you shoot an animal, you kill it. And you need to honor that. And you need to treat it respectfully, and you need to take good care of the meat and thank it. And I feel pretty strongly about that. When I catch a wolf, I never kill them. My job is to release them as minimally harmed as possible, see that they're in good shape, take care of them while they're sedated, and make sure as best as I can that they recover fully. So it's almost like catch and release, right?
Indeed.
for trapping. But I know I've run into some unethical hunters and unethical trappers, and that's where the rub comes in light of the general public, and I can't disagree with that.
And so As a scientist, you're studying the behavior of the animals and then how their population is growing and adapting to this new space. That coincides with during your career reintroduction happens in Yellowstone. And these sort of questions of science start to roll up into wildlife management. They sort of interact with politics and policy. And talk about your entry point into all of a sudden interfacing with how policies are made.
So when I was first beginning wolf work, they were fully endangered, and they became more, populations grew and grew, and then wolves were introduced 15 years after I started up here in northwest Montana. And eventually these populations grew larger and larger and were delisted or downlisted. And there were more wolves and there were more conflicts. Some of the conflicts can be mitigated with pretty well-studied means of aversive conditioning and just better livestock management practices and or removing wolves. In terms of how I dealt with the policy changes in politics, you have to. It's there. And there are a lot of wolves in the state now. There's no doubt about that. The changes I've seen enacted in Helena are not necessarily those recommended by wildlife biologists, which I feel is a tragedy. We have good paid professional people that do research, analyze data, and understand better ways of potentially managing all of our wildlife species, whether it's a prairie bird or an edible animal or whatever. And I find it a shame that, especially with wolves, the science is now in the background and the policies are based on politics and winning votes. I feel that, and it's tough. It's difficult for me because I wish people would treat wolves just like another animal in the forest.
If wildlife biologists were the ones making policy, or if science was driving policy, what does that look like if a wildlife biologist was running the show? I'm not necessarily getting to the specifics, but like, what are the key questions and interests that you're balancing from the scientific perspective?
First, you have to have a better knowledge base. You have to take an elk herd or an elk population. Let's just say elk. It doesn't matter if it's elk or deer or moose. And you have to know if the population is stable. Is it trending up? Is it trending down? How have the winters been? Because the severe winter has the most impact of all on big game populations. Additionally, you have to know what are the sources of mortality. Some wolves, some lions, some bears, some vehicles, some winter. And instead, what I find is that wolves take the brunt of the blame. That's the feeling anyway. There's not any scientific data to show that that actually happens. Matter of fact, there's a lot of research that shows the other. It shows it's wolves, in case of elk, are one of many factors, and they're not the dominant one. It's actually mountain lions. But you don't see them making these laws in the legislature to cut the mountain lion population in half, or to hunt them 24/7, or to go out at night with electronic lights and electronic game calls and shoot them with spotlights. It just is mind-boggling to me. I don't get it.
And do you have a theory as to why wolves are unique in that way? That the absence of vitriol around mountain lions, for example?
Well, I do. Part of it, I go at length in my book in a chapter to explain about the origins of wolves and fear from humans. And part of it, I think, perhaps it's because we humans have a society that's more much like wolves. We have a family-based community, home based out of parents and relatives and siblings. We defend our territories as humans with war and burglar alarms and armed guns in some homes. And wolves do the same thing. They defend their territories and they'll defend them to the death. I think we have so many parallels because we're both social species that live in packs, human packs, wolf packs, and have very many similar behaviors. I find it quite fascinating, actually. And wolves tend to mate for life unless a mate is killed. So perhaps that is part of it. And beyond that, I would go into some of the stuff that's in my book a little more in detail.
Yeah, that point, Diane, about how humans and wolves share some similarities in social dynamics, that's particularly interesting. And you do talk about this in your book, and it is a delicate space for biologists. This notion of anthropomorphization of species, the naming of wolves rather than the numbers, and how these wolves become characters and they are portrayed dramatically in a number of books. The whole thing about wolf watchers in Yellowstone and so forth. So this sort of similarity, but also this tendency to maybe extend that story to similarities that are a little too humanizing. That's an interesting balance to strike.
It is an interesting balance, and I talk about a couple of specific wolves in my book, Phyllis
Yeah,
and Sage, and we had names, but there's also Wolf 8550 and Wolf 8401. They had numbers, but when you talk to people, even Glacier Park personnel, if you talked about a number, they didn't know who it was. You tell them the name, they know who it was. So it became easier, but every wolf did have a number, and throughout my career, I was very carefully treading the line to be right on the line and not cross over too far into advocacy. I felt that was really important to be respected as a biologist professionally.
sure.
And in this book, I've crossed that line somewhat by trying to present information through stories and give the reader some personal insights into how wolves live. I'm not cuddling them. I'm not anywhere. I present some of the stories like Phyllis. I wrap up the end of her life asking questions and leaving the readers decide what they want.
And it's a beautiful tension in your book, Diane, because you're portraying your job as a scientist, but as a human being, how could you not grow a sense of, at the very least, affinity, if not attachment, for these animals that you're not only sharing space with, but you have to pursue a deep sort of intimacy with, to just engage in the trapping and be committed to ethical practice of that trapping and caring for the animal and so forth. Yeah, that balance is, you can detect some of that internal tension in the book. And I think you're right
I'm
about it,
glad that
really.
came through because I was very careful about it. And in this book, I open up a little more of my heart than I have professionally. And I've done dozens and dozens of academic papers and that sort of thing. But I felt strongly because the sentiments about wolves have become even more divisive and a lot stronger anti-wolf in recent years than they were earlier. And that was a big motivator for me to write this book, was that to present the science of wolf ecology and management through stories that anybody could pick up. Whether
Yeah.
you love wolves or hate wolves, wouldn't matter. It's a read with some interesting stories. And I really hope to open some minds. That's what I wanted to do. Hopefully I will.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this conversation with wolf biologist Diane Boyd next week. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsors are First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Kelly Larson is our producer. Maddie Jordan is our production assistant. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. And Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.